We are honored tonight to be joined by our featured speaker, Aaron Niederhelman. Mr. Niederhelman speaks and writes of the unique opportunity for the population densities of the Northeast United States to establish a new benchmark for domestic food systems through promoting environmental and human health to rectify an addiction to cheap food. His passion to reform a broken food system led him to work to remediate the modern plagues caused from chronic illness and obesity directly associated with the deteriorating value of the Western diet. He is co-founder and managing director of the Entrepreneur Agrarian Fund, which works with skilled holistic farmers and global thought leaders to promote regenerative agriculture to a broader audience. He was honored as a 2015 Eisenhower Fellow, focused on nutrient security, food system reform, and water access, and has traveled to Europe and the Middle East to gain insight from the front lines to learn how to contend with the natural resource and water management. His recent efforts have focused on bolstering innovation economies in local fisheries and better promotion of the differentiated values of North Atlantic sea proteins. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Aaron Niederhelman.
Thanks, Megan. Well, thank you very much. Hello, neighbors. Yes, very good. Thank you, President Alexander. President Doyle, thank you. I'm sure you're here. And Megan, thank you for orchestrating. It was very nice. So, yes, this is a very unique opportunity to come and speak to friends and neighbors of the Auburndale community, Newton. We live right around the bend, right down on Seminary Ave. Most of you are probably familiar with our house. We're the ones that have had for the last 11 years a few different dogs that have welcomed you as you walk by our fence. Our first dog was a Greater Swiss Mountain Dog, very large, but ultimately a great sweetheart. But she liked to get her voice heard, and I think she was favorably known by the students as Cujo. So, yes, well, she was sweet. And our new dog, too, Grace. You probably have seen Grace, but I welcome you to stop in at any time and say hello, because Grace is very kind. So, this is unique for me, too, because we have a couple celebrities in the audience, one being up here on screen. My two children and actually wife are here, so this is the first time they've actually heard me speak in a public environment, which is exciting. Not only because this gives them a chance, hopefully I don't mess up, and they can see, well, they put all the eggs in one basket, make sure he does a good job. And I'll try to reduce my swearing because we have a swear jar at home, and I will keep that very clean. So I don't want to get busted for that, right, guys? Okay. So yeah, as mentioned, and I'm going to have to turn a little bit. I apologize because I have a computer screen, and I just updated a slide deck here. So as Megan mentioned, I have been focused on food system reform for about 11 years now. We moved into this fine home, which actually was owned by the college previous to us. It was the bed and breakfast of the village for many years. 1892, Queen Anne Vic with unbelievable detail. It's been a phenomenal house. We enjoyed it greatly. And what has been the labor of love for me is the backyard. Actually, right around when we moved in, I went out and studied. I was lucky enough to study with a soil biologist out in Corvallis, Oregon. World-renowned soil biologist, and I was actually at the time focused on golf, which is a very unique way of getting into food systems, in fact. You don't find many people that work for the PGA Tour that are actually interested in getting rid of the use of synthetic chemicals. But that was actually one of the areas that we were trying to work with them on as a unique identifier for new courses of the future and desirability, because ultimately they're a billion-dollar marketing platform and they're trying to appeal to a new clientele. So I went out and studied with this unbelievable, who's become a mentor of mine, and she was actually very much responsible in coining the idea of what's called the soil food web. And that's effectively within soil, we have a trophic level micronutrient cycling program. This is called the soil food web. And it works the same way that we have a food web above ground, but it's in the soil. And what's unique about it is that within 1 tablespoon of soil, you have 7 billion living organisms. So as much as the world population you have in 1 tablespoon of healthy quality soil. And soil is very different than dirt. Soil is teeming with ecology. It's teeming with all this different micronutrients and high density quality stuff that basically is the impetus for all growth and nutrition that we have in all terrestrial production. So little did I know when I went out there and was studying about golf that I was going to have a game changer. It actually happened to coincide when we had our first kid. I was the only one out there in Corvallis, Oregon, studying the idea of ornamentals and reducing the use of synthetics to make a green greener. Everyone there was in food systems, and they were doing systems at scale. They were doing 10,000 hectares of almond production or of huge scale dairies that were making this migration. In 2006, this was very progressive for our country. In fact, we were taking many of these methodologies from foreign countries and trying to learn from their best practices, often because they ran up against the glass ceiling and couldn't grow using synthetic practices. They had a smaller island, highly condensed, and they couldn't continue to expend on natural planetary boundaries. So we, being out there in a very progressive group, and it is Corvallis, Oregon. I don't know if you've ever been out there, but it was an interesting experience. But beside all of the long hair and what people define as maybe the hippie element of things, some incredibly smart and talented people that taught me about Bt enzyme and persistent pesticides and the neurotoxins that were being put on our food systems and things that were just happening underneath our nose that we didn't even know about. So returning back to our yard here, where I came back, and at the time I still had a kind of a burn my saddle about staying with golf, but this became our test grounds, and it came focused on composting. And so right back here in this area, and I'll be happy to, as I now have 8 cubic yards of soil to spread this weekend, so anybody that wants to help can come by and help. There's a big pile up there. I actually have been working on compost of all different types. So we have vermicompost, which is worm composting. We have thermocompost, which is a process where you migrate soil, you add oxygen and moisture at the right time. We have static compost, which are windrows. And I'll be happy to talk to anybody about these afterwards and what the advantages and what the values are. But it was just a learning experience for me of getting your hands dirty. And for me, it was, at the time, I was still sitting behind a desk every day. And I realized that getting my hands dirty cleaned my mind too. It was a unique connection back to what was happening with where I wanted to go in the future. So after many years of working on the yard and focusing things, we made a full commitment and started looking at food after realizing that this was my calling. I couldn't stop reading books about it. I'd go to every event. I was subsidizing getting into programs and traveling over the country to see events. It was everyone looks for those epiphany moments of why we're here. And this was surely it. And it can coincide with obviously our kids and my wife too has been an unbelievable supporter of this, and my co-pilot in the whole program. She's equally into this as I. So you can only imagine the conversations we have at the dinner table about food systems, but they're exciting to us. So, as President Alexander said, food is this very unique thing where we're all eaters. So I can get up here and speak about this, but everyone in the room has the equal experience that I do of eating. What we need to do is become more engaged in that process. And in this country, we've been put in a situation where we've, through excellent marketing and through kind of a dissuasive process, we've lost that understanding of what the true values of food are. And there are many true values of food, and that's nutritional, that's cultural, that's family, and that's what it means to our environment and our ecology. And all of these things you start to learn are this holistic or circular approach to how this whole program works. And kind of at the highest level, you realize that what we have to do is start to connect and return ourselves to being part of nature instead of trying to control it. And when I say food, why we're all eaters here is we're increasingly working within a shrinking planet. And the idea of planetary boundaries is a concept that came out of Scandinavia, which basically looks at that we all live on a self-finite resource. It's a self-contained finite resource. And at 7 billion people now, with an expected population to grow to 9 billion by 2050, the responsibility is on us and how we feed ourselves to understand how the rest of the system is going to work. We're really at the point where we have control over how the whole system works. And we're at the steering wheel, and we're doing a pretty poor job, especially in this country, at controlling this best practices of understanding of getting ourselves back into natural process. So as mentioned, soil is the key for me. This is really what got me into it. And I say food is a regenerative natural resource. And we talk about natural resources, but it's very interesting because up until recently, we've taken water, which is incredible. We're the most valuable natural resource. It's us. Water is us. And we don't even treat it as a commodity. It's less than a commodity. We don't even give it value. It's a practice that we have excessive amount of waste in not just the way that we treat it as us in urban or rural environments, but in our agricultural practice. 70% of fresh water in this country and around the world is actually used in agricultural irrigation systems. And the process that we use in a center pivot process or non-best practice, which encourages evaporation and poor practice of utilization, really doesn't revert back to soil. It actually increases evaporation. So we have many of these old practices that have scaled that don't work with the best practices of water, and then looking at how water correlates with soil. So soil obviously is this. It's the bugs. It's the, as I mentioned, the 7 billion microorganisms in a tablespoon of soil. And really what that is it's a process that takes waste and turns it into plant-ready nutrients. And that plant-ready nutrients makes it so that the next higher levels in this trophic food web can then consume that, and that's how we continue to build up different levels of health throughout the whole ecosystem. So soil for me was again the key driver here. This is part of what I'm going to be spreading here over the weekend. This is actually at our house, finding high quality, rich nutrients. Another element here, and this is what I've become more privy to in the last couple of years, is looking at the marine trophic pyramid, which is looking at what's happening with our seas and how that also is just a substrate of different trophic levels within the soil itself. And when I say trophic levels, it's just the circular process of food systems within it. And we have these low level of the plants and the mollusks, and then the larger fish and the fin fish, and we keep moving up to the point where we think of the fish that we consume as eaters. So these key parts for us is really where we start to have to look at how we're going to drive change, and us being the eaters being connected to this, and what's happening with our fisheries. So for instance, our fisheries globally, a study in 2013 showed that 92% of global fisheries were stressed or overstressed. And you have a series that just came out in the end of January of 2017 that showed major population densities, especially around China and the South Asian Sea, are at a point where they're expecting exhaustion of their natural fisheries, the wild harvest fisheries, by 2025. And the interesting fact of that is by 2025, China is supposed to be consuming 40% of all sea protein globally. So we've got an interesting correlation here of what's happening, of huge influx of interest in sea proteins, and us becoming just taking and not giving back. So this reverts back to the same idea of we're all eaters. And these are kind of key elements here, what we're looking at, which is a one shared health. And this is something you'll see throughout the presentation. I talk about one health. One health means that the animal's health is environmental health, human health, and ecological health. And all of these correlate. And we have to have a better appreciation of this holistic perspective of nutrient cycling and the values associated to treating animals well in the process, but also treating ecology and soil and water well. It's our responsibility. You've seen many of these sayings from the true expense of cheap food. And when we say expense, people think of cost or what you pay at the grocery store. But when I say expense, I'm actually talking about what the expense is on the environment. What's the contamination? What's the energy utilization? What's the practices involved in that growing of this methodology? What's happening with the soil and the destruction of using synthetic chemicals on this or persistent pesticides? And how do we address these issues? So many of these food values come back to, reverting back to many of the methodology that I would say within this audience probably is more in line with a time frame when you grew up or when your grandparents or your parents grew up, which you knew your farmer. You knew people within your neighborhood that were producing food. In the US right now, the average foodstuff travels about 1,800 miles per individual item that reaches our grocery store. In our region here in the Northeast, which we have the highest population density of education and affluence, we have about 5 to 7% of total local or regionalized food system production in this area. We need stronger commitment to having better values in our food, that correlate with regional production. And it's not just because, yes, it makes sense and we got to get more local dollars flowing with our farmers, but if we look at this even as a national security issue, there's a famous saying that says every society is 9 meals away from major disorder and disruption, and that's very true. Because our food system, our sustainable food system, or our unsustainable food system, currently based off the current production models where we have monocultures around the world that then distribute to one region, means that we're about 5 days away from major disruption of supply chain. So a huge catastrophic issue could put us in a huge tizzy quickly. It's concerning. Okay, so I'm not trying to, I'm giving you the bad information first to then go and say, there's positivity coming up here. There's our other celebrity right there. It is always about the sprouts, and it's always about the kids and looking forward. And I think this is an appeal that makes sense to everyone, and whether these are your kids or your grandkids. We always talk about, so I come from a finance background, and everyone's concerned about their succession planning or looking at saving for the future or looking at for their retirement program. Well, I can guarantee that if we don't invest in these different initiatives, and we don't start treating our ecology, our environmental issues, our food systems, all of that will matter not. We have to invest in these programs like we're having a long horizon perspective of investing in our retirement programs. And that's an essential part. And some of the claim that we give to folks is just by eating better, you're doing better for your grandkids or your kids. And there's a lot of truth to that. So I'm going to take you to a different part of the world to talk to you a little bit about the unintended consequences of food systems and really around the staples of life, which are water and food and protection. 2 years ago in 2015, I had the opportunity to spend a month in Turkey. It was a very interesting time to be in Turkey. They were right in the midst of their presidential election, or their new presidential and prime minister election. I was in Ankara a day before the bombings happened there. It was a major disruption within the country. And what I came to learn in dealing and getting unique access to their political leadership, to their agricultural leadership, to their business leaders, through a fellowship program, as Megan mentioned, through the Eisenhower program, was much of this was an unintended consequence in what's happening within Turkey from their own fruition. So in about 2005, they started to dam off the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, the original rivers of Babylon. And this is a very interesting region when you look at societal development, and also when you start to look at the impetus of agriculture as a whole. This is where agriculture began in Mesopotamia 10,000 years ago. So this was really the origin of what we know as kind of modern life, when we started to control our own destiny and went from a hunter-gatherer's approach to actually looking at how we could then develop as a society and culture. And through this process, and even just in the last 10 years of damming off these waterways, and it's not just saying a couple dams here and there, they put up 1,500 dams in a matter of a 10-year period. They put up 2 dams that were twice the size, both of those dams, twice the size of the Hoover Dam. And they did this, believe it or not, so their president at the time and their prime minister was Erdogan. He wanted to become energy independent from Russia. And hydropower became a very unique, easy methodology for Turkey because you have the mountains of Turkey, the water flows south, it goes through the mountains, you get this perpetual rain and snowfall, and it gives them the opportunity to have a consistent supply of sustainable energy, right? Hey, this is exciting. As part of that too, they get this excessive amount of water, they decided that they're going to begin to irrigate lands that are not high quality, good agricultural lands. But they looked at this as a secondary, maybe tertiary value of this energy independence. So currently Turkey is in the top 10 of global agricultural export. They do about $50 billion or euros of agricultural export per year. But by 2025, through this new damming of this system, which is happening in the south of Turkey, right on the Syrian border, original Mesopotamia, what their objective would be is to triple that to 150 billion euros within a 10-year period and become one of the top 5 agricultural exporters in the world. So they're looking at this and saying, what an opportunity, what a value this is happening. But what's unique is these rivers have an unintended consequence because that river flew into Syria. and flew into the rest of the Middle East. And by damming it off, they trickled the water supply by 75% in a matter of a 5-year period. When you overlay that with massive drought that happened, you had a situation where Bashar al-Assad, who came to power at the same time, took this as a very unique opportunity for tyranny and oppression. And the tyranny that he implemented there was to look at this and say, when I control the staples of life of water and food systems, there's a very unique opportunity for me to have my way. And it set into stage a Syrian situation where it was fight or flight. And when you have nothing to fight for, like, your family can't eat, they can't have water, and it's not like what we think of California going through a series of drought where everyone can't take a shower every day or you can't water your yard. This is significant drought at supreme levels. There's no sign of it because there's also someone controlling the spigot every time you try to get that open. He looked at this as an opportunity to take a political leadership role, and he did. So by Turkey deciding that they were going to become energy independent from Russia, the unintended consequence of this within the region was they had 4 million Syrians that now live within Turkey as refugees. So over that 3 to 4 year period in the last few years, and when I was there in Istanbul and in Bursa and other regions that are even more rural, it was immersive. You saw it everywhere. And it was a very unique thing to see because maybe the comparison will be the Irish or the Italians in this country at a certain period, 80 or 100 years ago, where no one wanted Syrians working for them. There was a very ostracizing approach to the Syrians actually coming up and working within Turkey. And it was, you saw a lot of people living on the streets. It was a challenging situation to see. So what I find very interesting is returning back to the States here and looking at this is you start looking at the snowball effect of that. And you look at the staples of life and how tenuous they are really in one region and the effect, because you can make a direct correlation of what happened within Syria and Turkey and the rest of Europe with Brexit, or what's happening with Le Pen in France, or what happened here with Trump in the US, because there's a strong conservative mentality when people are oppressed. You vote conservative when there's concern and fear. And that could be levered well by good politicians. So you start to look at this one region where the origin of where our culture, society, agriculture all spawned from, again having global effect. Asia Minor having global effect on what's happening in global economies now. And it's being done at really a Moore's Law now where things are being expedited so quickly. So I found that uniquely interesting as I was there during that time period to study agriculture. And people don't put agriculture as a main driver in what's happening in global affairs as being, this is the impetus for what's happening in global affairs. So, we like to say in many of our writings and discussions is that we now live in a shrinking world. We live within those finite resources. We live within planetary boundaries. So how do we deal with this? Maybe the wrong audience here, I'm not sure. This is from a 1980s movie with Chevy Chase called Christmas Vacation. He was a salesman for a non-nutritive cereal varnish. And the reason I put this up here, because it's just so exciting. And I love his mom's reaction, because I think that says it all over in the corner of this. Oh, this gasp. I look at our agricultural systems and our food systems here in the U.S. to be different than most, especially most that are within the sustainable agricultural systems. I really don't believe they're out there to get us. I don't believe they're out there to mess with us or to continue to stamp us down. I think it's just a perpetual practice that continued to stack on itself, and it grew and grew and grew, where I really believe that many of the seed companies think that the only way we're going to feed the world is through their genetically engineered seed system or through the pesticides that they promote. And I think that there is a certain delusion that comes with that, but I think there is an element of they do believe they're doing it for the right reasons. The same way that Clark W. Griswold was selling a non-nutritive cereal varnish to pay for his new pool. They are doing this to support their families, and because they do, I think many of them want to do it. Of course, there are bad apples. There are many people that we hear the stories of, and I think those get the limelight. But I think most of the people working for these big companies are fine people. They just need to see the light of day. That they have not associated that we do live within the shrinking world. I also think that folks within modern food system don't look at this in this perspective, that we're solving the wrong problems, that we're antiquated production models, and that we are not in a world of boundless resources. And the reason I say that is because these companies were asked to create boundless sources of energy to feed the world, and they've done it very well. They weren't told to do it at the expense of the environment. They weren't told to do it at these different, and it's created these big businesses that continue to develop. And the reason I say this, and it's a bit of an optimist perspective, I'm an entrepreneur, is I really believe the only way we're going to fix the system is to actually have a seat at the table and express to them that the future, the only future we have, and the future of the buying public cares greatly about many of these best practices of food systems and this correlation of food as preventative healthcare and this correlation of food as preventative human and environmental healthcare. And when they see that, they're big businesses trying to meet the needs of their consumers. So many of the more progressive thought leaders, from Gary Hirschberg to Fred Kirschman and Dan Barber, will say the same thing, that if we really want to enact change, we got to get these big companies agreeing with our methodology. There's no doubt we are running into a situation where we're an overfed and undernourished country. We have, by 2025, the expected obesity rate in this country is supposed to be 45%. Now you think about that, 50%, nearly 50% of our population is going to be obese. And if there's any question about the correlation of food systems being directly tied to that, you can look at the statistics that right now we spend about 6 to 7% of our discretionary income on food. In 1970s, we spent about 17, 18% in that range. And if you look at our healthcare costs, it's actually the complete adverse effect. So in the 1970s, our healthcare costs were about 5, 6, 7%, and now they're nearly 20% of GDP. And that's all reactionary healthcare. And what we like to say about food is that food is healthcare. Food's preventative healthcare. We got to get out of this mentality of that reactionary element is the only methodology of healthcare. And we get big healthcare companies to start looking at food differently. That's when we can really move the needle and change things. So, you know, these loss of the staples, as we talked about before, from the ecological and environmental issue, which is a destructive practice from linear best methodology or poor methodology. Water issues with what's happening in California, where it makes limelight, we see what's in California, but really what's happening with our Ogallala, which is a very large aqueduct system that runs the center of our country. That's now, by some estimations, down to about 25%. And this is a glacial deposit water system that cannot be replenished, especially in the methodology we're using. So what we're doing is we're converting lands that are not meant to grow crops in the central part of our country. We're growing corn and soy that are extensive and use a lot of water, and they use the chemicals actually to basically grow the plants. And the chemicals are unlocked. The nutrients comes from using water to create this practice of dumping the salts, and it's giving a steroid shot every time. And you continue to give a steroid shot. And we're using water to unlock this energy. So we are setting ourselves up to basically have another Dust Bowl in the center of the country. And it's going to happen at scale. And it will happen, I'm not even going to say, not my lifetime, it's going to happen in the next decade. And we're doing this at a practice because we're taking our product, we're commoditizing at a level, and we're shipping it globally. Again, looking at that stat that the average food stuff comes from 1,800 miles to here, well, we're doing the same thing to others. So we're taking all of that high quality nutrient value from our soils, and we're shipping around the world for whoever wants to pay the cheapest price. So those are concerns. Those are big concerns. Who's looking out for this? Who's checking that? And I think what we've seen is it's not coming from a federal level. It's not going to be a regulatory force. Hopefully we still have an EPA soon enough. We'll see. Hopefully we still have a USDA that can have funding resources to look at this differently. But what I get excited by and where I'm involved in is the innovation economy around this, and looking at the volumes, and especially being on a campus here, and looking at the volume of students and folks that are in their 20s and 30s that are really becoming engaged in food systems, you get very excited by these opportunities. You look at this and say, well, maybe the pendulum has swung so far out of whack that we're reverting back, and we're going to do it in a time that we don't get to that worst case scenario, but we actually look at this and say, well, some of these free markets and the drivers and the reassociation of food as preventive healthcare will get us there before that. And I think that's what we're seeing. And in epicenters and population densities, that's where the excitement lies. That's where people are getting connected to this better food system. What I focus on, and I do focus mostly on animal agricultural practices because it's the highest trophic level. We process about 9.3 billion animals a year in this country alone. And many of the animals are ranged from beef cattle. Beef cattle is the largest single sector of U.S. agriculture. We process 35 million animals a year. If you think about that volume, think about 35 million animals. And about 99% of those beef cattle animals are not living environments like this. 99% of them live in what are called CAFOs, which are confined feeding environments, which we think of. And to do that, what we've done is we've increased population densities where these animals are not healthy anymore. And the producers that run these farms, who are running on all about expense and cost, what they have to do is they have to find shortcuts in order to keep these animals healthy. And they don't try to invest in the health of the animals. What they do is they prophylactically and preventively feed animal antibiotics. And antibiotics, which are a very important part of our medical system, right? We've all had those situations, whether it's for ourselves or our family, and we know the essential part of that. 80% of antibiotics in this country actually are fed to animals on farm. And if you want to talk about One Health and how this directly shows the storyline of that, you start to look at food animals being a key part of how we're going to change this, because what's happening now is we don't just eat the meat of this, but we take all the byproduct of these animals and we spread them on our fields that grow, our cabbage or our spinach or our lettuce. And we hear of these foodborne illnesses that are propagating out of these things. And much of that is because of the shortcuts we're using in food animal production. Much of what we've seen in superbugs in hospitals, we have 2 million cases a year in our healthcare system coming from superbugs that cost just this country alone 30,000 lives and about $30 billion. And we're the only country in the entire developed world that hasn't made the correlation that this is coming from food animal production. We have made that correlation, we just don't want to admit to it. So I had an opportunity to go to Europe, and I studied their model, which looked at remediating the use of antibiotics in food animals, and I studied the Dutch and the Danes. And I looked at their approach to actually integrating a better practice and method of looking at this differently, of actually starting to invest in consumers to be the driver of change. And in a 10-year period where the Dutch, who had a very similar model where over 95% of their production was in CAFOs, they do a lot of, not as many large animals, their dairy was large animals, but they did a lot of pig production and poultry production. They remediated the use. They got rid of prophylactic use to, for the practice of stocking density and weight efficiency by 75% in 10 years. And they had the exact same system that we did. And by doing that, they got rid of these superbugs popping up in their hospital systems by 35 to 40%. So there's a direct correlation now what we're seeing. And what we have to do in this country is start to learn from other people and their best practices. Again, I don't think it's going to come at a mandate level. I think it's going to come from a consumer level. Here's a little more on AMR resistance. I'm so excited. I always say I'm the worst person to have dinner with because I know everything about the food systems, and I always talk about the great stuff. I'm like, ooh, don't eat that. And we've learned to tone that stuff down and say, but you asked me to speak to you, so I'm going to, no, just kidding. So what we're seeing here is by 2050, if we continue in the practices that we have now, if we look at these practices of continue to feeding food animals 80%, keeping these stocking densities, and focus on animals as just commodities and not investing in their welfare, you can look at what's happening with antimicrobial resistance, AMR. We will have more deaths associated from that than cancer and diabetes combined. That's an expected hit on the economy of $100 trillion by 2050. So if anybody's not looking at this, and whether we look at this as a public health issue or we look at this as an economic driver for global economies, this is a major problem. And as President Alexander was saying, this affects every part of who we are. This is my problem and your problem, our kids' problems, and our grandkids' problems. We can control this. We can control this by buying pasture-raised animals. We can control this by looking at things differently, investing in your food system. We can control this by composting your own food. It starts small. You start by looking at what you can do, and really what it becomes is a correlation of understanding and appreciation. I look at this very much like what we've done with now proteins. This is effectively looking at proteins being food animals. They make up 60% of our food system. But us as consumers, we've already gone down the path to start to look at food differently, from our beer, our wine, our sweets, our savories, our coffees, our teas. We've all elevated these standards. Starbucks isn't good enough for me anymore. I want the pour over, and that's not even going to be good enough for me next year. I remember going to college, I would buy a 12-pack of Natural Light for like $5. And I'd be like, oh man, I got a whole $5. And now I buy a 4-pack of beer for $20. You start to look at this and say, so my values have changed. I start to care about, what are the hops? What's the barley used? What's the value of this? Who's producing this? Is there fair trade in my coffee? But somehow, the largest segments of our food system, we haven't done that with. We haven't looked at proteins. So we launched a private equity fund, which has a terrible name. It sounds like, oh my God, hedge fund, what are you guys going to do? And it comes in and people think the worst. But we were really taking a model to actually do value creation, which in the world of finance is tough to come by. But we're actually trying to create something that was different. We're trying to use private equity to invest in really progressive concepts, to look at things differently, and to invest in a smart practice. We developed this methodology where we actually were buying stressed and distressed areas, which in our region of the Northeast, it's some of the only agricultural infrastructure that we have left. And many of those farmers are in their 60s, they have no succession plan, they have no liquidity, they're sitting on a $5 million asset, and there's no one that wants to take over that dairy farm, because at the top level we have a federal government that controls the price of milk. We have done this since the 1970s. And they control it based off the price that's coming out of Wisconsin or California, which means that unless you're a 25,000 head dairy production, you can't compete at a federal level. You're not making money. You're milking your cows 3 times a day and you're losing money. Our biggest dairies in this region are 3,000 head. And the only way to make money in agriculture at this point is through scale. So all of those farmers, unless we call it penny weighted milk, which just means 100 pounds of milk, unless it's over 22, 23 cents, nobody's making money. And right now it's trading at about 17 or 18 cents. So just give you an idea that you're milking your cows 3 times a day. So 1.5 of those times, 1 time of that, you're not making any money from that labor or from that distribution. So we're coming in and buying those assets and converting them into livestock operations. And we were trying to do this at scale. We were working with the regional and local food movements to try to develop meat production where we had provenance of the food. We had using technology to show there's greater value. The methods that we're using for pasture-based animals are your health. There's great value in actually investing in this and putting a little more money. We had the economics to a point where it would be a 20% premium, meaning that would you spend $1 more for a high-quality grass-fed beef pound of burger meat compared to the other stuff? And it becomes a no-brainer when you know the truth and the knowledge of it. So we started this about 3-4 years ago. I'm co-founder. I was manager director. I'm no longer doing that. I actually have launched a new initiative that focuses on the supply chain part of that, using some of the best technologies, trying to do some of these practices at scale at a national level, of introducing what's happening from the better farming practices and pipelining it all the way through the supply chain, so we have a true understanding of what's happening in working with large retailers and wholesalers to actually give them that information. So what we see at our wait tablecloth restaurants, when the farmer knows the chef knows where the farm is coming from, and they can give you some nuance and backstory of it, we want to do that for the Chipotles, the Whole Foods, and even the McDonald's of the world. So we're trying to get more people to invest in raising the minimum thresholds, which is what I learned was the key driver in Europe to get that, is to get rid of the overuse of antibiotics and start to invest in animal welfare, and that's the driver of change. The other part about this too is we're here, we're the highest level, we're the top of the food chain. It's our responsibility. And noblesse oblige just means that we're obligated. These are living, sentient animals. And the practices we use for these, and we've seen these exposés, we've seen what's happened. Well, the way we change those is investing in better food systems. Food environment's key. I'll jump ahead. I know I'm going along here, but I had a chance in Turkey to study under a guy named Alan Savory. Alan Savory is a believer that by actually returning animals back to pasture, getting animals back actually on open environments, is our best practice for sequestering carbon. His belief, and I'm a strong believer, and there's quite a bit of science that backs this up, to your point, is that we're looking at a situation where our phytoplankton in the oceans are being destroyed at alarming rates. Our tropical rainforests are not going to come back within a generation. That 60% of land is grasslands. And what's happened with many of our grasslands, you look at the Southwest, is when we take off the pasture-based large animal, pasture-based animals, we basically have depleted many of those ecological best practices. So that they're part of the symbiotic relationship of having these large hoofed animals that run on the plains, turn over the soil, put manure on it, and actually encourage vegetation to grow. And if you start to do that with grasslands and you control that environment, and getting these animals to replicate predators back to what actually happened over a 200 million year period, we're basically in a situation where we can start to control getting much of this carbon, the excess amount of carbon that we've dug up in the last 50 years, and putting it back into the soil, which is effectively the sponge of the earth. So if you're interested in this, I'd be happy to share more information, but a guy named Alan Savory, he's out of South Africa in Zimbabwe, and he has many of these satellite locations around the world. And I studied their goat production facility, goat and sheep production facility in Anatolia. And it was very interesting to see. And they do national and global conferences focused on that. So food and environment becomes another key player for many reasons, of not just our footprint, but actually getting the whole food system involved into it. Another key thing here, and this is such an essential part because we live right by the sea, 90% of what's caught in our pristine waters of the North Atlantic are actually commoditized and shipped globally. And what's so crazy is that we actually import 65% of what we consume in this region from other parts of the world. So you look at this and say, well, wow, how does that happen? And the way it's happened is it's another one of those situations where it's a supply chain that's just gone whack. It's just gone out of control. We haven't made the correlation that this is not what the consumers are looking for. And we're also running into a situation where much of farming, much of fishing is still hunter and gathering. We still go out there. Can you imagine the days if we were still reliant on catching meat by going in the open plains and killing our meat? We have to integrate farming practices into our ocean, which means we start to look at best practices to give back to the ocean instead of just taking from that. And what we've done for many of those practices, what we think of aquaculture, is we've gone right to the similar of a CAFO environment. We've gone to the worst case scenario. We haven't done any biomimetic approach to investing in these sea proteins that this could be our saving grace. 3 billion people across the globe are reliant on sea protein for their major caloric intake for the day. Go back to the South China Sea or South Asian Sea, and it's going to be depleted by 2025. We need to get involved in ocean farming in a better, different practice. Shellfish aquaculture is one of the best practices, especially in our region. This is a very unique model. Bivalves are one of the best practices because not only do they create a high quality, great sustenance and good value, there's a great book by Paul Greenberg called American Catch that looks at how the city of New York was effectively built on the oyster and how this infrastructure was a major part of what this came from. That the state of Rhode Island 115 years ago actually had over 30,000 acres of aquaculture shellfish production done, and now they have 200 acres. So we have unbelievable opportunity to control our own destiny. And these are great models to do this. And there's we've seen in these regions is an investment in bivalves and the interest of this, of clams and razor clams, quahogs, mussels, especially oysters, is that these animals, which are very prolific, they have about 100 million eggs in a life cycle, and what's very unique about them is they filter 50 gallons of water a day. So if we want to clean up our estuaries and our value, we plant the seeds of oysters. So what we talked about with folks, and it's easy to pitch this to the younger generation, is that it's not just a necessity but an opportunity, and it's not just an opportunity but a necessity. It's an easy pitch to the younger folks who are all believing in this. The harder pitch, and that's what we're focused on, is making that translation to the folks that control this food system now. And that's what I was speaking to earlier about. We have to have a seat at the table in order to change this. A couple companies control over 80% of total food production. Okay? So it's just like big banks. It's no different. We have to be involved, and it's not going to come from a regulatory side. So as consumers, we can control our own destiny. So whether environmental or social impact, human or public health, or political or planetary stability, the agent of change on a shrinking planet is how we decide to feed ourselves. And that could not be more true as the planet continues to shrink, as we use more of our natural resources, and we continue down a path of linear perspective. So the great part about this is this can change in less than a generation. This can change from a major campaign from educating our kids, folks that are having young kids, folks that are involved in that. When that happens, and we can do this at scale, we look at the recycling movement, we look at the non-smoking movement. We have great examples of precautionary practices in this country. Food for somehow, we all eat every day, all the time. We don't make that correlation. We think it's too expensive, and we invest in cheap food. And the adage of, pay the farmer or pay the doctor, well, the adage should be pay the farmer or pay the doctor 10 times over. Because that's effectively what's happening in our food versus our healthcare system. So food is preventative healthcare, and that's planetary and human healthcare. So what we're involved in is getting and encouraging more people to be involved. I personally believe it's through food animal agriculture. That's the area that has the most concern, that can change the quickest, and can be a driving force to the consumer. So there's my contact information. I've done a bunch of writing, and I do other speaking engagements. Feel free to, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them afterwards. You can email me. And like I said, I'm spreading some compost. You can stop by the house, and you don't even have to lend a hand. We can talk about things. I'll show you my vermicompost, right? How exciting to see a bunch of 100,000 worms. It's exciting. I thank you very much for your time. It was very Questions?